I took the overnight shift because the money was better. That was the only reason. 30% differential for nights, and I had a truck payment 3 months behind. It wasn't complicated. I wasn't brave, I wasn't dedicated, I just needed the cash. Chapleau in October is not a place that eases you in. It hits you all at once. The cold, the dark, the way the town just stops at its own edges like it knows better than to go further. I'd driven up from Sudbury with 2 bags and a Coleman cooler and told myself it was temporary. 1 year. Save enough. Go back south. The school was small. 43 students across 6 grades. 1 hallway that smelled like floor wax and old lunch bags. A staff room with a coffee maker that only worked if you held the button down for the first 8 seconds. The other teachers had been there long enough that they'd stopped noticing things. I hadn't been there long enough to know what to notice yet. I noticed the birds first. It happened every morning. Not sometimes, every single morning without variation, starting from my first week in September. I'd be walking from the staff parking lot to the side entrance, coffee in one hand, bag over my shoulder, and at some point during that walk the town would just go quiet. Not gradually. Not the way sound fades when clouds come in. All at once, like a switch, the sparrows that roost in the spruce trees along the fence line, gone silent. The crows on the power lines stopped. Even the ambient low-grade noise of a town waking up, the idling trucks and the screen doors and the distant dog. It would all just pause. Then, 90 seconds later, everything resumed. Like nothing had happened. The first time, I stopped walking and looked around. Nobody else reacted. A woman scraping her windshield kept scraping. A kid waiting for the bus kept staring at his phone. I stood there in the parking lot feeling like I'd imagined it, and then I went inside and taught long division and forgot about it until the next morning when it happened again. By the 3rd week, I started timing it. I'd stop walking, pull out my phone, hit the stopwatch. 90 seconds. Every time. And I started paying attention to when it started, trying to catch the exact moment. It was always 7:43 a.m. I checked against my phone, against the clock above the side entrance, against my car's dashboard. Always 7:43. Always 90 seconds. Always complete. I asked one of the other teachers about it in October, casually in the staff room, while we were both waiting for the coffee maker to heat up. I described what I'd been noticing, the silence, the timing, the birds. She looked at me for a moment, not like I'd said something strange, more like she was deciding something. The bell schedule's always been like that, she said, and then poured her coffee and left. The bell didn't ring at 7:43. The first bell was 8:15. I checked the schedule on the staff room wall 3 times to make sure I wasn't miscounting, and I wasn't. 7:43 had nothing on it. 7:43 was not a bell time. It was not a shift change. It was not a bus arrival. It was nothing. I let it go because I didn't know what else to do with it. But I started watching the students. Here is what I noticed over the following 2 months. They knew. Not in a way they showed. Not in a way I could point to and say, look, that's proof. But I watched their faces during morning entry, and at 7:43 every single one of them would go still for those 90 seconds. Not dramatically, not in unison in a way that would read as synchronized. Just each of them individually would pause whatever they were doing. A girl tying her shoe would stop with her fingers on the lace. A boy mid-sentence to his friend would trail off and look at nothing in particular. Then it would end and they'd all resume, and if you weren't watching carefully you would have missed it entirely. I was watching carefully. I tried to ask a student once. Grade 6. A quiet girl who sat by the window and finished her work early and spent the remaining time reading. I waited until after class and asked her, as simply as I could, if she'd ever noticed the birds going quiet in the morning. She looked at me with an expression I still think about. Not surprise, not confusion, something that looked almost like pity. They do that, she said. Do you know why? I asked. She picked up her book. Doesn't everybody? She left before I could answer. And because I was a 24-year-old who was already being treated like an outsider in a town of 800 people, I did not push it. I told myself it was a small-town thing, some local habit I hadn't learned yet, an explanation I just didn't have access to. I found the yearbook in March, in a box of old school materials I was sorting through to make shelf space in the supply closet. It was from 1987. Black and white photos, that particular font that dated it instantly. I was flipping through it mostly out of boredom when a page near the back fell open to a section that looked like it had been handled more than the rest. It was a staff schedule page. The daily timetable, printed in small type, with handwritten annotations in the margins. Most of them were faded and illegible, but one was dark enough to read, written in careful block letters. 7:43, 90 seconds, do not go outside. That was it. No signature. No explanation. No indication of who wrote it or why or what they thought would happen if you did go outside. Just a notation that had been sitting in that closet for 36 years, written by someone who had clearly noticed the same thing I had noticed, and who had drawn a very different conclusion about it than I had. I stood in that supply closet for a long time. I left Chapleau in June at the end of the school year. I didn't renew. I told the principal it was a personal decision, which was true in the sense that I'd personally decided I didn't want to spend another winter timing silences in a parking lot and watching children go still at 7:43 a.m. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found in the yearbook. I didn't know how to explain it in a way that didn't make me sound unwell, and I'd also spent enough months in that town to understand that the people who'd grown up there had chosen, collectively, not to explain it. Whatever it was, they decided to live with it in silence. That wasn't my silence to break. I went back to Sudbury, got a position at a larger school, paid off the truck, moved on. For a while, I genuinely thought I had. 7 years later, I got a follow request from an account I didn't recognize. I accepted it without thinking much about it, and a few days later a DM came through. Hey, you were my grade 6 teacher in Chapleau. I always wondered if you ever figured it out. I stared at the message for a long time. It was the girl, the one who'd asked if everybody knew. I typed back. Figured what out exactly? 3 dots appeared. Stayed for almost a full minute. Then disappeared. No message came through. I waited 2 days and sent a follow-up. I found a note in a yearbook from 1987. Do not go outside. Do you know what that means? The 3 dots appeared again. Disappeared again. Her account went private the next day. She never replied. I've sent one message since about a year after that. Just 3 words. What did you know? It's been delivered. It's been read. The little seen indicator has been sitting there for 14 months. No reply. I think about the note sometimes. Do not go outside. I think about the fact that I was outside every morning, timing the silence on my phone like it was a curiosity. I think about the fact that nothing ever happened to me, and I don't know if that means the note was wrong, or if it means something else entirely, something about what I was or wasn't to whatever that silence belonged to. I think about the other teacher, and the way she said the bell schedule's always been like that, with the tone of someone ending a conversation rather than answering a question. I think about 36 years of mornings, 90 seconds each, all those people standing still in parking lots, fingers on laces, sentences left unfinished, and not one of them, in all that time, ever feeling the need to explain it to someone from outside. We thought you knew. I didn't know. I still don't. And I have spent a long time trying to decide whether that makes me lucky, or whether it makes me the only person in that town who was ever truly in the dark. Felix warned me about Werner before I ever met him. Not in a dramatic way. Not the way you'd warn someone about a dangerous person. He said it the way you'd mention a loose step on a staircase. Matter of fact, almost apologetic, like he should have fixed it before I arrived. The old man next door, he said, carrying my bag from the car. He's a bit much. Just don't engage. I didn't ask what that meant. Felix had grown up in that house, and I figured there was history I wasn't owed yet. We'd been together 8 months. I was meeting his mother for the first time. I had other things to focus on. The house was on the edge of Canso, which is the kind of town that feels like it's been slowly exhaling for 40 years and hasn't finished yet. The harbor was beautiful in the way that abandoned things sometimes are. Half the storefronts on the main strip were dark. The population, Felix told me without effect, had been dropping since the cod moratorium. His mother had stayed because she'd always stayed, and that was the whole explanation. Werner's house was separated from theirs by about 12 feet of grass and a low wooden fence that had lost most of its paint. I saw him that first evening, standing near his back steps, looking at nothing in particular. He was old, 70s, maybe older, thick through the shoulders in a way that age hadn't entirely taken yet. He didn't wave. He just watched us unload the car with an attention that felt less like curiosity and more like inventory. I looked away first. The garden was the thing that didn't make sense. I noticed it the morning after we arrived. I was up early, standing at the kitchen window with coffee, and Werner was already outside in the gray 6 a.m. light, moving between the rows of whatever he was growing along the fence line. That wasn't strange. What was strange was what was growing. It was October in Nova Scotia. The ground should have had nothing in it. Felix's mother's own garden, 6 feet away on our side of the fence, had been cleared weeks ago. Bare soil, a few dead stalks she hadn't pulled yet. But Werner's strip along the fence was dense and green and flowering in a way that made no botanical sense. Dark-leafed plants I didn't recognize, low to the ground, with small waxy blooms in colors that seemed slightly wrong in the morning light. Not wrong like sick. Wrong like a color that doesn't quite have a name. I mentioned it to Felix's mother at breakfast. She looked at the window instead of at me and said he had a good hand for growing things. Then she changed the subject, and I got the distinct feeling that she'd changed it not because it was awkward but because it was settled. A thing that had been decided long ago not to discuss. The knowing was harder to explain than the garden. On the second day, I was talking to Felix's mother in the kitchen about a friend of mine who'd recently had a miscarriage. I hadn't told Felix yet. I'd been carrying it for 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment, and I brought it up quietly while Felix was in the shower. That afternoon I was standing in the backyard, and Werner appeared at his fence. He didn't say hello. He looked at me with that same inventory expression and said, "Losing someone is hard, even when it wasn't yours to lose." He went back inside before I could respond. I stood there in the cold for a long time. I hadn't spoken loudly. There was no window open. I've gone over it many times, the geometry of that kitchen and that yard, and I cannot construct a version of events where he could have heard what I said through 2 walls and a closed door. I didn't tell Felix. That night I woke at 2 a.m. and lay still and listened, and from somewhere outside I could hear movement. Slow, methodical, not trying to be quiet but not loud either. I went to the window. Werner was in his garden, kneeling at the fence line, working at the soil with his hands. It was 2:17 in the morning, for degrees outside, and he was in a shirt with his sleeves rolled up, pressing something into the earth with the focused attention of a man who considered this normal. I watched him for 11 minutes. He never looked up. He never stopped. Here is the thing about dread, the particular kind I'm talking about, not fear exactly, more like the sensation of a floor becoming slightly less solid under your feet. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. And by the 3rd day I had accumulated enough that I was no longer dismissing individual incidents and had started connecting them into something that had a shape. The dog was the last piece of that shape. Felix's mother had a retriever, 10 years old, calm and slow and friendly to everyone. I had watched that dog approach strangers in town and push its head into their hands within 30 seconds. On the first day, it had climbed half into my lap before Felix pulled it off. It would not go near the fence. Not avoidance in a loose way, not the way dogs sometimes give a wide berth to things that smell unfamiliar. This was specific and absolute. If you walked it in the backyard, it would go within 5 feet of the fence and then stop and plant itself and refuse to move forward. Not barking. Not growling, just stopped with its weight back like something on the other side of that fence had at some point made the dog a promise about what would happen if it came closer, and the dog had believed it. On the 4th morning I went outside alone. Felix was still asleep. His mother was at the pharmacy. I walked to the fence and looked at the strip of garden on the other side. Up close, the plants were stranger than they'd looked from the window. Some of them had been tied with strips of fabric at their base. Dirty white, frayed, the kind of fabric that had been something else before it was this. The flowers were closed in the morning light, folded shut in a way that looked less like overnight dormancy and more like deliberate withholding. There was a section near the middle post where the soil was darker, softer, recently worked. I don't know why I did it. I've asked myself that many times since. I think my body made the decision before my mind had finished the argument, because before I'd consciously decided anything I was already crouching and pressing my fingers into that soft dark soil and feeling for what was underneath. It was about 4 inches down. A small bundle, wrapped in wax cloth, bound with the same dirty white fabric as the plant ties, to fit in my palm. I unwrapped it without standing up, working quickly without knowing why I was hurrying. Inside, a small curl of dark hair, 3 teeth, human, small, a child's back teeth, and a piece of paper, folded twice, the ink faded but legible. My name, my full name, and a date, not my birthday, not any date I recognized. A date from 4 years before I had ever heard of Canso, before I had met Felix, before I had any reason to exist in that town or that yard or within reach of that fence. I called Felix's mother from the pharmacy. My voice was steadier than I expected it to be. I described what I'd found and asked her what it meant. The line was quiet for long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. Then she said very carefully, "Which tin?" "It wasn't in a tin," I said. "It was wrapped in cloth." Another silence. "Which part of the fence?" she asked. I told her. I heard her exhale. "There were 3 tins," she said. "We found them when Felix was 12. I put them back. I didn't know what else to do. I asked her what was in them. She didn't answer that question. Instead she said, 'Come inside and lock the back door. Don't speak to him before you leave.' I put the bundle back in the ground. I don't know why, some instinct that removing it would be worse than leaving it. I patted the soil back over it and went inside and locked the door and sat at the kitchen table until Felix woke up. I didn't tell him what I'd found. We left the next morning. I made an excuse about work. Felix's mother hugged me at the door in a way that lasted slightly too long and felt like an apology for something she couldn't name out loud. Werner was at his fence as we pulled out, standing still watching the car. In the passenger mirror I watched him get smaller and then disappear. I never went back. Felix and I ended things 6 months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with Canso on the surface, though I have never been fully sure that was true. About 2 years ago, I got curious in the way you do at midnight when you should be asleep. I searched Werner's name. His full name, which I'd seen on a piece of mail that had blown into the yard once and which I'd remembered without meaning to. No results. Not one. No social media, no local paper mentions, no property records, no obituary. No record, as far as any search I could conduct was concerned, of him ever having lived in that town. I searched the address. The house is listed as vacant. Has been since at least 2009, according to municipal records. I closed the laptop. I haven't searched again. I think about the date on that paper sometimes. For years before I knew Felix, before I knew Nova Scotia existed in any personal way. I think about whatever process leads to writing a name on a piece of paper and burying it in the ground next to a fence, and I think about the patience that implies and the certainty, the absolute certainty, that eventually the person whose name you've written will come and stand in that yard. And I think about the tins, 3 of them, put back in the ground by a woman who didn't know what else to do. I've never asked Felix whose names were in those. I don't think I want to know. The sonar reading made no sense. I ran it 3 times. Not because I thought the equipment was malfunctioning, the equipment was fine. I'd calibrated it myself that morning and the readings on everything else were normal. I ran it 3 times because the alternative was accepting what the screen was showing me, and I wasn't ready to do that in the first 5 minutes of what was supposed to be a routine survey pass. I was working out of Bamfield on a contract with a marine research institute, bathymetric mapping of a section of the inlet floor that had been flagged for a habitat assessment. Standard work. I'd done the same type of survey a dozen times in other locations. You go out, you run your passes, the sonar builds you a picture of the bottom, and the bottom looks like a bottom, irregular, organic, the kind of chaos that geology makes when nobody's watching. Rocks and silt and the slow accumulated wreckage of things that sank or died or just settled over centuries. What the screen was showing me was not that. Bamfield sits at the end of a long inlet on the west coast of Vancouver Island, the kind of place that takes 45 minutes to reach on a gravel road and feels, when you arrive, like the road was the point and the town was incidental. The research station there is small, a handful of permanent staff, rotating contractors like me, a floating dock that creaks in a way you stop hearing after the second day. I'd been there 3 weeks when I found it. The survey area was about 2 kilometers from the station, in a section of the inlet that narrowed before opening again into deeper water. Nothing about it looked significant from the surface. Dark water, forested banks, the occasional seal. I'd done 2 previous passes in other parts of the inlet and gotten exactly what I expected: irregular bottom topography, some interesting depth variation, nothing that would make anyone sit up straight. The third pass was different. The sonar return came up clean and sharp, which was the first thing that was wrong. Organic seafloor absorbs and scatters, you get soft edges, gradual transitions. What I was seeing had hard edges, defined angles, a formation approximately 40 meters across that repeated a single geometric unit, a hexagonal shape, roughly 2 meters per side, across its entire surface with a consistency that natural processes do not produce. I cut the engine and let the boat drift and stared at the screen for a long time. Then I picked up the underwater camera and went to work. I want to be precise about what I documented, because precision is the thing I have left. I made 4 camera drops over the formation, pulling the housing down on a weighted line to about 9 meters, letting it run for 3 minutes per drop. The water clarity that day was good, better than usual for the inlet, which runs turbid with tannins from the surrounding forest. In the footage, the formation was clearly visible. The hexagonal units were not random. They were not approximate. They were exact in the way that things are exact when something has decided they should be exact. Each angle, each edge, each adjoining face fitted to the next with a tolerance I would not have expected from any geological process I'd been trained to recognize. The material was dark, denser looking than the surrounding silt, with a surface texture that the camera light caught differently depending on angle, not quite reflective, not quite matte. Between the hexagons, in the channels where they met, there was no silt accumulation. On a natural seafloor, that age would show fill, sediment gets into every gap over time. These channels were clean. Either the formation was recent or something was keeping them clear. I filmed for 40 minutes across 4 drops. I shot stills with the second camera. I logged everything with timestamps and GPS coordinates. I was methodical because I am always methodical, and because some part of me understood. Even then, that methodical was all I was going to have. Back at the station, I loaded the footage onto my laptop and watched the first drop in full. Then I loaded it onto the station's shared drive to back it up, the way I backed up everything at the end of each day. The transfer completed. I watched the progress bar finish and the file appear in the directory. I closed the laptop and went to dinner and sat with 2 of the permanent staff and ate halibut and talked about the weather system coming in from the northwest, and did not mention what I'd found because I was still organizing my thoughts and I wanted to review everything again before I said anything. After dinner, I went back to my cabin and opened the laptop. The footage files were corrupted. All 4 of them. Not partially, completely. Every clip from that day's drops opened to static and then an error. The stills were the same. 43 image files. Every single one unreadable. I checked the station drive. The backed up copies were corrupted too. I sat with that for a while. Equipment failures happen. Corrupted files happen. It's usually explainable. A bad card, a moisture issue, a transfer error. I went through every explanation I knew, and none of them accounted for the simultaneous corruption of original files and backup copies of different file types on 2 separate devices. I still had the GPS logs. Those were fine. I still had my handwritten field notes. Those were fine. And I still had the prints. Before I transferred the stills to the laptop, I had, out of a habit I developed early in my career, printed 12 of them directly from the camera's SD card using the portable inkjet I keep in my kit for field documentation. Old-fashioned and slightly ridiculous, and the reason I still have something to show. The prints were clear, sharp, exactly what I'd seen on the screen during the drops, the formation, the angles, the clean channels between units, the particular way the camera light caught the surface texture at depth. 12 photographs of something on the floor of a Vancouver Island inlet that should not exist. I spread them on my cabin floor and looked at them for a long time. In the morning, I emailed 3 colleagues, researchers I trusted, people with the background, to look at what I was seeing and give me an informed response. I attached the GPS coordinates and a description of the formation and told them I was sending photographs by mail. 2 days later, I got the first reply. She said she'd received my email, but the attachment hadn't come through. Could I resend? I hadn't sent an attachment. I said I was mailing prints. The second reply came the same afternoon. He'd received the email. He said the attachment was blank. A white JPEG, nothing on it. Again, I had not sent an attachment. The third colleague didn't reply to the email. She called me instead. She'd received the email, she said, but it had arrived in her inbox 3 times, each copy sent from my address at the same timestamp, which her mail server had flagged as a delivery error. None of them received the prints I mailed. I have the post office receipt. The envelope was addressed correctly. It never arrived. I went back to the survey area twice after that. The first time, for days after the initial survey, the formation was gone. Not buried, not altered, gone. The sonar showed standard irregular bottom topography. I dropped the camera anyway and watched silt and rock and the ordinary chaos of a seafloor that had never been anything else. The second time, I wasn't looking for the formation. I sat in the boat with the engine off for about an hour, in the specific location where I'd been when I first saw the reading, and I tried to think about it clearly. What I kept coming back to was the clean channels, the absence of sediment accumulation in the gaps between units. On a formation of that scale, in that environment, natural processes would have filled those channels over years, decades at minimum. Either the structure had appeared recently, or something about it actively prevented accumulation. Both of those options required something I didn't have a framework for. I finished my contract at the end of the month. I wrote my survey report for the habitat assessment and included the GPS coordinates from the third pass with a notation that the return data had been corrupted and the area should be resurveyed. I don't know if anyone did. I never followed up, and I've examined my reasons for not following up enough times to know that they don't fully hold together. The 12 prints are in a waterproof folder on a hard drive that is not connected to any network. I put them there not because I was being dramatic, but because I'd watched 2 devices corrupt simultaneously and I didn't want to watch a third. I've shown them to one person, a colleague I trust more than most, someone with 30 years of marine geology and enough intellectual honesty to tell me when I'm wrong. He looked at all 12. He didn't say anything for a while. Then he said, "What's the formation material?" I told him I didn't know. I hadn't been able to get a sample. He looked at the prints again. "The angles are exact," he said. "I know," I said. "Natural processes don't do that." "I know," I said. He handed the prints back. He said he'd like to see the raw sonar data. I told him it was corrupted. He nodded slowly, the way you nod when the answer doesn't surprise you but you were hoping for something different. He hasn't asked about it again. I haven't brought it up. I think about the clean channels. I think about 40 meters of exact geometry sitting on the floor of an inlet that 45 minutes of gravel road keeps mostly to itself. I think about whatever process produces a perfect hexagonal unit and then repeats it without variation across a 40-meter span, and I think about how long something like that takes, and what it means that it was there and then it wasn't. Mostly I think about the sediment, the absence of it, the channels kept clear by something for some purpose over some span of time I can't calculate. Something made that formation, something maintained it, and when I found it, something decided I had seen enough. The prints are still clear. I've checked. Whatever took the files on the devices didn't reach the paper. I don't know what to do with that except keep it dry and wait. She never moved his chair. Not once in 11 years. I know because I visited every summer without fail, and every summer it was there, pulled slightly away from the table at the angle he'd left it, like he just stood up to get something from the counter and would be back in a moment. The rest of the kitchen changed over those years. New curtains twice, a different refrigerator, the linoleum replaced with something that looked like wood but wasn't. The chair stayed exactly where it was. Same angle, same distance from the table. A fixed point that everything else arranged itself around. My aunt was not a sentimental woman in the obvious ways. She didn't cry at funerals. She didn't keep photographs on surfaces. They were in albums in a drawer where photographs lived. She drove the same truck for 19 years because it worked, and she didn't see the point of changing things that worked. When my uncle drowned in February of 2003, she made the calls herself, handled the arrangements herself, Went back to work at the co-op 3 days after the burial because standing still, she said, didn't suit her. The chair was the only outward thing. And because it was the only thing, I watched it the way you watch the one detail that doesn't fit. Not with alarm exactly, but with attention. Took me 4 years to understand that the chair wasn't grief. It was practical. My uncle had been an ice fisherman his whole life. Not as a hobby, as a serious cold-weather occupation that he treated with the same methodical commitment other men gave to professions that paid better and killed them slower. He knew the lakes around Flin Flon the way some people know their own houses, which pressure cracks to trust and which to avoid, where the pike ran in February, how long a given spot had before the season shifted under it. In his 58th year, the ice shifted faster than he'd calculated. They found the truck. They didn't find him until April, when the melt made it possible. My aunt identified him and came home and made dinner and did not speak about it again except in practical terms. The estate, the insurance, the question of what to do with his equipment, which she resolved by putting it in the shed and leaving it there. The first winter after he died. She told me the following spring. She'd woken at 3 in the morning to the sound of the back door. She didn't tell me this dramatically. We were sitting at her kitchen table in July, drinking coffee, and she mentioned it the way she'd mention a repair she'd had done on the truck. Factual, mildly interesting, not requiring much in the way of emotional response. She said she'd heard the door, the specific sound of it, the particular way the latch caught that was different from any other door in the house, and she'd lain in bed for a moment and then gotten up because that was what you did when you heard a door. The kitchen was empty. The back door was closed and latched. But the floor between the door and the table, that stretch of linoleum that was there then, before she replaced it, was wet, boot-shaped, 2 tracks, right size, right stride, coming in from the door and stopping at his chair. She said she stood in the doorway and looked at the prints for a while. Then she went to the cupboard and got out the good whiskey, the bottle she kept for when his fishing friends came by, and she poured 2 glasses and set one at his place. In the morning, both glasses were empty. I asked her if she'd been frightened. She picked up her coffee cup and considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. No, she said. He came in cold, same as always. I wasn't going to leave him without a drink. I want to be honest about my reaction to this, because I think honesty is the only thing that makes what I'm telling you worth anything. My first reaction was not belief. My first reaction was concern. The quiet, careful concern you have for someone who has lost a person central to their life and may be constructing something to fill the space. I didn't say that. I asked questions instead. Practical ones, the kind designed to find the mundane explanation hiding underneath. Condensation. A dream she'd half woken from. The house settling in the cold and her mind filling in the rest. She answered each one patiently and without irritation, like she'd already asked herself the same things. I know what I saw, she said. Not defensively, just as a fact. I let it go. It was her grief and her house and her way of holding things, and it wasn't my place to take it apart. But I started paying attention differently after that. He came back every winter. That was the pattern, as my aunt described it over the years, always in the cold months, always through the back door, always the same wet tracks to the same chair. She stopped being surprised by it after the 2nd year and started leaving the whiskey on the counter instead of putting it away after company. More efficient, she said. She told me other things gradually, over many summers, in the same matter-of-fact way. The cold that came in ahead of him, not drafty cold, not weather coming in cold, but a specific sustained chill that settled in the kitchen before the door sound and lifted by morning. The way the chair would sometimes be at a slightly different angle by the time she came down. Not dramatically different, just shifted, the way it would shift if someone had sat in it and then stood up. The smell she eventually identified as his particular smell. Lake water and machine oil and the specific brand of soap he'd used. Present in the kitchen on those mornings and nowhere else in the house. She left the light on for him. A small lamp on the counter, always on through the winter nights. He came in from the ice, she said once when I asked about it. A light on is a light on. I told my mother some of this carefully one Christmas. She listened without expression and then said that her sister-in-law had always been private about her grief and we should respect that, which told me that my mother had either heard a different version or had chosen a different way of holding it. I went to visit in November once, the only time I was there in winter. Work had brought me to that part of Manitoba, and I added 2 days to see her, and I arrived on a Thursday evening to find her in the kitchen making soup and entirely unsurprised to see me. I slept in the spare room and woke at some point in the deep of the night to the cold. Not drafty cold. I want to be careful here because I know how this sounds, and I am not someone who reaches for extraordinary explanations when ordinary ones are available. This was different from the ambient cold of an old house in a Manitoba November. It was specific and localized, coming from the direction of the kitchen, and it woke me the way sounds wake you, with a sense that something had changed in the air. I lay still for a while. Then I got up. The kitchen light was on, the small lamp on the counter. The floor between the back door and the table was wet. 2 tracks, boot-shaped, stopping at the chair. The chair was occupied the way a chair is occupied when someone's weight is in it, a suggestion of compression, of presence, that I am aware sounds like nothing but did not feel like nothing at 2 in the morning in a cold kitchen in Flin Flon. I stood in the doorway for what was probably 30 seconds but felt longer. Then I went to the cupboard where I'd seen her keep the whiskey and I poured a glass and set it at his place. I don't know why exactly. It seemed like the right thing to do in a situation for which I had no other protocol. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep again until the cold lifted, which was about an hour later. In the morning my aunt came downstairs, saw the empty glass, and looked at me with an expression that was partly surprised and partly something warmer. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know," I said. She picked up the glass and washed it, and that was the entirety of the conversation. We had breakfast and she asked about my drive and I told her about the road conditions coming north and we talked about her truck, which needed something done to the heating, and the whole morning was entirely normal. Except I kept looking at the floor, at the place where the tracks had been. The linoleum was dry. There was no trace. My aunt died in March, 4 years ago. She went in her sleep, which I choose to believe she would have considered efficient. I drove up for the estate, and the neighbor who had a key let me in, and I stood in the kitchen for a long time before I started going through anything. His chair was still at its angle. 11 years after she'd last seen him walk out to his truck, the chair was still pulled away from the table the way he'd left it. I inherited the house. I haven't sold it. I keep the small lamp on the counter on through the winters because it seemed wrong to stop. I don't stay there in the cold months. I'm not sure I'm ready for that. But last February my neighbor, I asked her to check on the pipes periodically, sent me a message saying everything looked fine, no issues. Then she sent a second message a few hours later. She said she didn't want to alarm me, but when she'd come through the kitchen she'd noticed the floor was wet near the back door. She'd dried it up. She said it was probably condensation, or maybe a seal on the door had gone. She mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that there were 2 glasses on the counter, both empty. I haven't asked her about it again. I'm not sure she'd want to talk about it, and I'm not sure I would either. But I think about what my aunt said on that July morning with the coffee cups between us. He came in cold, same as always. I think about 11 winters. A light left on. A glass poured without hesitation for someone who had no business still being thirsty. And I think that whatever comes through that door in February has, for over 2 decades now, come home to a kitchen where someone made sure it knew it was still welcome. I think that matters. I'm just not sure to whom. He told me not to take that road. He said it the way you'd tell someone not to touch a hot pan. Not a suggestion, not a superstition, just a plain fact delivered without drama and then left alone. I thought he was being territorial. That's the honest version. I was 38 years old. I had a forestry contract in my 3rd season, and I had developed the particular arrogance of someone who has spent enough time in remote northern Alberta to stop being impressed by it. I knew the terrain. I knew the weather patterns. I knew which roads washed out in spring and which logging tracks were maintained well enough to trust with a loaded half-ton. I had built, over 3 seasons, a working confidence in that landscape that I confused, the way people do, with understanding it. Rowan had been working Fox Creek's surrounding forests since before I was certified. He was Cree, quiet in the specific way of someone who has learned that most conversations aren't worth the energy, and he had a habit of saying exactly one thing about a subject and then considering it said. He didn't repeat himself. He didn't elaborate unless you asked directly, and sometimes not even then. He told me once, early in my 1st season, that the land up here had its own agreements and that most people from the south came in without knowing what those agreements were. He said it without accusation. Just information, the way you'd brief someone on a worksite hazard before they started a shift. I'd nodded and filed it away in the category of things I respected without fully absorbing. That was my mistake. The road showed up on a Tuesday in late October. I was running a timber cruise on a section of Crown land about 40 kilometers northwest of town, checking stand density and flagging for a survey crew coming in the following week. Standard work. I'd done the same section twice before and knew the access roads well enough that I wasn't consulting the map constantly. The road I didn't know was off a forestry track I'd used a dozen times. It ran northwest, unpaved, wider than a game trail but not by much, disappearing into the spruce with the particular purposefulness of something that had been used regularly and recently. No signage. Not on my survey maps. Not on the Provincial Forestry Access Index I'd downloaded the previous week. I sat at the junction for a moment with the engine running, looking at it. There was no logical reason to take it. I had a planned route, I had daylight to manage, I had flagging to complete. The rational decision was to continue on the track I knew. I turned onto the road anyway. I've thought about why, and the best I can do is this: it looked used. It looked like something that went somewhere. And I was the kind of person, at that point in my life, who followed things that looked like they went somewhere. The first thing I noticed was the dust. There was no wind that morning. I'd checked before leaving because wind affects cruise measurements, and the air had been completely still since before dawn. That particular dead air stillness you get in northern Alberta in late October when a pressure system has settled and decided to stay. No wind. Not a branch moving, not a flag stirring on the equipment in the truck bed. The dust on this road was rising. Not dramatically, not in columns or clouds, just lifting slightly from the surface in small slow eddies, the way road dust behaves when disturbed by passing vehicles. Except there were no passing vehicles. There was only my truck, moving at about 20 kilometers per hour, and the dust rising ahead of me rather than behind, disturbed by something I couldn't see moving in the same direction I was moving. I told myself it was a ground-level air current, a thermal differential between the road surface and the surrounding tree cover. I told myself this with some conviction and kept driving. The compass went wrong about 3 kilometers in. I had a dashboard compass, the stick-on kind, not sophisticated but accurate enough to orient yourself on a grid system. I'd used it all season without issue. I glanced at it out of habit when I noticed I was losing my sense of direction, which is a thing that happens on winding forest roads and usually self-corrects within a few hundred meters. It was spinning. Slowly, continuously, with no apparent relationship to the direction the truck was actually pointing. Not malfunctioning in the way compasses malfunction, a stuck needle or a frozen bearing, but rotating with an almost deliberate consistency, like something was turning it. I picked up my phone to check the GPS compass. The phone showed no signal, which was not unusual for the area, but the compass app, which doesn't require a signal, was also spinning. Same direction, same speed. I stopped the truck. In the sudden quiet after I cut the engine, I became aware of the radio. I'd had it on low, a talk station out of Edmonton that I kept on mostly for background noise during long drives. In the silence, I could hear it clearly. It was playing the same 4 seconds of audio on a loop. Not a station fault, not static, not the crackle of a signal dropping in and out. The same 4 seconds. A few words of a sentence I couldn't quite catch and a half bar of music underneath, repeating cleanly without glitch over and over. I turned the radio off. The display went dark. In the silence that followed, I sat very still and looked through the windshield at the road ahead. The figure was at the tree line, 40, maybe 50 meters ahead, where the road curved slightly left and the spruce closed in on both sides until there was maybe 4 meters of clearance. Standing at the edge of the tree line on the right side. Still in the way that things are still when stillness is a choice rather than a condition. Not frozen, not rigid, but absolutely intentionally motionless. I could not see detail at that distance through the light that October morning gives you, which is thin and comes at a low angle and makes depth judgment unreliable. I could see shape, standing height, facing the truck, not moving. I sat with my hands on the wheel and looked at the figure, and the figure did not move, and the dust continued its slow rise from the road surface, and the compass continued its slow rotation, and the air continued its perfect stillness, and I understood. with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than building gradually, that I had come somewhere I had not been invited. Not trespassing in the legal sense. Something older than that. The sensation was not fear exactly. Fear has an urgency to it, a directional quality that tells you to move. This was something different. This was the feeling of a door that had been left open, and something very large and very patient on the other side of it becoming aware that you were standing in the frame. I put the truck in reverse. I didn't turn around. I reversed the entire 3 kilometers back to the forestry track, watching the road ahead of me in the rearview mirror, watching the tree line, watching the place where the figure had been until the curve of the road took it out of sight. The dust stopped rising the moment I hit the main track. The compass settled immediately. The phone signal returned within 100 meters. I drove back to Fox Creek and I sat in the truck outside the equipment yard for a while before I went in. Rowan was doing maintenance on the ATV when I found him. I told him what I'd seen. I described the road, the location, the dust, the compass, the figure at the tree line. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment, working a wrench against a bolt that didn't need much more attention. "You stopped," he said. "Yeah," I said. He nodded once. "Set the wrench down." "Good," he said. I waited for more. He picked up a different tool and turned back to the ATV. "Rowan," I said, "what would have happened if I hadn't stopped?" He didn't answer immediately. I'd learned by then that his silences weren't evasions. They were the time he took to decide how much of a true answer the question deserved. "You'd have kept driving," he said finally, "for a while. And then," he looked at me then, directly, in a way he didn't always. "You wouldn't be here asking me that," he said. He went back to the ATV. I understood that the conversation was over, and I understood that I had been given more of an answer than most people who asked that question probably received, and I decided to be grateful for it rather than press further. I finished the contract in November and took a position further south the following spring. I told myself it was a career decision, which was partly true. Before I left, I looked up the road on every map I could access. Provincial forestry grid, satellite imagery, the survey data from my own company's Access Index. I checked 3 different satellite platforms, pulling images from different years, looking for the junction I turned at and the road that had run northwest from it into the spruce. Nothing. In every image, from every year available, there was only the forestry track. No junction. No road running northwest. Unbroken tree cover in the direction I had driven for 3 kilometers in reverse with my hands steady on the wheel and something patient and enormous watching me go. I've been back to Fox Creek once since, 2 years ago, passing through on a drive north. I didn't stop at the equipment yard. I didn't look for the track. I know the road isn't on any map. I know that if I drove out to that section of Crown land and found the junction and turned northwest, the spruce would be continuous and unbroken and there would be nothing there to find. I know this, and I still took the long way around the whole area. Some doors you close by walking away. You don't go back to check if they're still shut. You already know the answer. My sister was gone for 9 days. The RCMP said she probably just wandered off the trail. Disorientation. The officer wrote in the report, the word sitting there on the page like it explained something, like it closed a door. She was an experienced hiker. She had done that trail 40 times. She knew the markers by heart. They found her 30 kilometers from where she'd parked her car, sitting on the shoulder of a logging road in the early morning. No injury, no hypothermia, no dehydration. She was calm. She was clean. She told the paramedic she was fine and asked if anyone had fed her cat. I drove 4 hours to meet her at the hospital. By the time I arrived, she was already dressed, already signing the discharge papers, already making a joke about the vending machine coffee. She looked exactly like herself. She sounded exactly like herself. I remember standing in the doorway of her room watching her and feeling, not relief exactly, something else, something with teeth. You spend 9 days believing someone is dead, and then they're not, and you think you should feel nothing but grateful. But the body knows things the mind hasn't caught up to yet. She had no memory of the 9 days. Not none, she had one. She remembered starting the trail on a Tuesday morning. She remembered the light being strange, The way it sometimes gets in late autumn when the sun sits low and flat and everything looks like it's been photographed through amber glass. She remembered stepping off the trail to look at something. She couldn't say what. Something on the ground, she thought. Maybe a bird. And then she remembered the logging road. The gravel under her boots. The sound of a truck in the distance. In between, nothing. 9 days, and for her it felt like an afternoon. She said it calmly. That was the part one couldn't let go of. She wasn't distressed. She wasn't frightened by the gap. She said it the way you describe forgetting where you put your keys, with mild curiosity, a small shrug. It felt like an afternoon, she said, stirring her tea. A very quiet afternoon. The behavioral changes were small. I want to be careful here, because I don't want to make her sound like a different person. She wasn't. She was still the same woman who called me every Sunday, who overtipped at restaurants, who cried at nature documentaries. She was still her. But there were small things. She stopped drinking coffee. She'd been drinking coffee since she was 15 years old. 2 cups a morning, black, no negotiation. After she came back, the smell of it made her feel sick. She switched to tea without comment, without explanation, as if she'd always been a tea person and I'd simply misremembered. Her handwriting changed. Barely, just a slight shift in how she formed certain letters. Her lowercase g had always had a particular loop, something distinctive, something I'd have recognized anywhere. After, it was slightly different, flatter. I found an old birthday card she'd sent me years earlier and held it next to a grocery list she'd left on my counter. And I stood in my kitchen for a long time looking at the 2 pieces of paper. I told myself it meant nothing. People's handwriting drifts. Trauma rewires small things. There are explanations. There are always explanations until there aren't. The laugh was the hardest thing to articulate. It was still her laugh. I don't want to overstate it. It wasn't wrong exactly. It was just slightly off the frequency I'd known for 30 years. Like a song played in a different key. You recognize the melody. You just have to lean in a little harder to place it. I found the old home video by accident. It was on a hard drive I'd had for years. A backup from our mother's camcorder. Hours of badly lit footage from birthday parties and holidays. I was looking for something else entirely when I found a clip from a summer barbecue. My sister, maybe 22, laughing at something off camera. I watched it twice. Then I sat with it for a long time. The laugh on the tape and the laugh I'd been hearing for the past 2 years were not the same laugh. I didn't say anything to her. What would I have said? I love you and your laugh is wrong and I can't stop watching this clip of you from 20 years ago? I kept it to myself. I told myself I was being irrational. I drove the 4 hours back to my apartment and I didn't tell anyone. I didn't call her that Sunday. She called me and I answered, and we talked for 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and when she laughed I pressed the phone to my ear like I was trying to hear something through a wall. She died 2 years later. A car accident on an icy road in February, clear and sudden, nothing drawn out. I got the call on a Thursday morning and I sat on the edge of my bed and I didn't cry for a long time. I just sat there, thinking about the hard drive, thinking about the barbecue clip, thinking about the logging road and the 30 kilometers and the 9 days that felt like an afternoon. Grief is supposed to come with a kind of certainty. You know what you lost. You know the shape of the absence. What I had was something else. A grief folded inside another grief, one I didn't have a name for. I inherited her things. Her apartment, her cat, her boxes of books and old photographs. I spent a weekend going through everything and I was fine, and then I found her phone in a kitchen drawer. Dead, but her landlord had kept the charger, and I plugged it in without thinking. Turned on. I wasn't looking for anything. I just sat there while it loaded, and I was going to turn it off. And then I saw that she had a voicemail. From her own number. Time-stamped 14 months after the accident. I pressed play before I understood what I was seeing. Her voice. Clearly, unmistakably hers. Not the frequency I'd been second-guessing for 2 years, but the voice from the barbecue tape, the voice I'd grown up with, the voice from before. Calm. Almost gentle. She described the 9 days. She described a place with no sky. Not dark, she was careful about that. Not a cave, not underground. Just a place where there was no sky. A ceiling of pale white that gave off light without any source, uniform and total. like the inside of a cloud. She described walking. She described something watching her that she never saw directly, only felt. A peripheral attention, like being the only person in a room and knowing it. She described the silence, which was not empty silence but full silence, the kind that has weight and pressure. She said the ground was soft in a way that did not correspond to any texture she had ever felt before or since. She said it calmly. She described it the way you'd give directions to someone you trust to find their own way. She said she was leaving this message because she thought I deserved to know. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me while she could. She said the thing that came back was not unkind. She wanted me to understand that. It was not unkind. Simply was not her. The message was 41 seconds long. I have listened to it once. I saved it to a drive I keep in my desk drawer. A small black rectangle no bigger than my thumb. I don't know what I'm keeping it for. Evidence, maybe, or just proof. Proof that she found a way to tell me. Proof that whatever was in that place with no sky, she was still in there somewhere, still herself enough to leave a message, still thinking of me. I call the landlord sometimes. He says her number has been disconnected since the accident. He says there was no voicemail service on the account. He says this in the patient tone of a man who has explained something twice and does not wish to explain it a third time. I don't blame him. I wouldn't believe me either. I'm not sure I believe myself. I just know what I heard. And I know that the voice on the tape was hers, the real one, the one from before, and that she sounded, at the end, like someone who had finally found the words for something she had been carrying alone for a very long time. The RCMP file is still open. I know because I checked years later just to confirm. Disorientation, the report still says. The word sitting there on the page like it explains something, like it closes a door. Doesn't. My mother called me every Sunday. For 11 years, from the September I left for university to the March she died. She called at 10:30 in the morning without fail. I was living in Halifax by then. She was still in the house I grew up in, on the same quiet street in Tignish, tending the same garden, feeding the same succession of cats. Every Sunday, 10:30, I could set a clock by her. I thought I knew her voice better than I knew my own. I started going through her things the week after the funeral. It was easier to keep moving than to stop. The house smelled like her, like the cedar sachets she kept in every closet, like the particular soap she'd used for as long as I could remember, and I moved through the rooms with boxes and tape and the focused blankness of someone who has decided to feel things later. I sorted books. I sorted clothes. I found 11 years of birthday cards she had kept in a shoebox in the hall closet. Everyone I'd ever sent her, in order, bound with an elastic band. That nearly broke me, but I kept moving. It was her neighbor's photographs that stopped me completely. The neighbor, an elderly woman who had lived next door since before I was born, had passed away the previous winter, some months before my mother. They had been close in the careful, consistent way of people who share a fence line for decades. When the neighbor's nephew came to clear out the house, he found a box of photographs addressed, in her handwriting, to my mother. He brought them over without opening them. My mother had put them in the sideboard and never mentioned them to me. I found the box on a Tuesday afternoon. I made tea. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. There is a specific kind of dread that has no sound and no shape, that arrives not as a feeling but as a sudden, total stillness, the way the air goes quiet before something falls. The photographs were organized by month. Someone, the neighbor, presumably, had written the months in pencil on small paper tabs. May, June, July, August, September. They were all from the same summer, taken in the garden next door. The neighbor was in most of them. At first glance, everything was ordinary. An old woman in her garden, in the particular golden light of a maritime summer, surrounded by the roses she had tended for 30 years. I went through them slowly. May, she looked exactly as I remembered her. White hair pinned back, practical clothes, a slight squint against the sun. June the same, July the same, and then August, and I paused, and I looked for longer than I needed to, and I told myself I was imagining things. People look different in different light. Photographs flatten faces. I'd been sorting boxes for 4 days on bad sleep and worse food. I set August aside and picked up September. I put it down again almost immediately. Then I picked it up again and looked at it for a very long time. The face in the September photograph was recognizably hers. Same white hair, same build, same garden, same roses, same light. But something in the proportions was wrong in a way I could not name precisely and could not stop seeing once I had seen it. The eyes were set slightly too far apart. The smile, she was smiling at whoever held the camera, was too wide and too even, and it reached the right muscles in the right sequence and still managed to look like a diagram of a smile rather than a smile itself. I sat at my mother's kitchen table for a long time. Then I called the nephew. He answered on the third ring. He was pleasant, unhurried. I thanked him for bringing the box over. I asked carefully whether he knew anything about that summer, whether his aunt had traveled, whether anything unusual had happened. There was a pause. He said she had gone on a long trip that summer, sometime in late July or early August. He said he hadn't known about it until she was already gone. She hadn't told anyone. When she came back, she seemed fine. He said this in the way people say things that have bothered them for a long time and never found a listener for. No one knew where she had gone. The mind wants a framework. It wants to sort what it's been given into a category that already exists, grief or stress or coincidence, because the alternative is standing in a doorway with no door behind you. I went back through the photographs. I looked at May and June and July again, the face I recognized, the eyes in the right place, the smile that moved the way smiles move. And then August, where something was beginning to shift in a way I couldn't isolate. And then September, where whatever the shift was had finished completing itself. I thought about the Sunday phone calls. She had called me every Sunday for 11 years. The calls from before that summer and the calls from after it. I had not distinguished between them. Why would I? She sounded like herself. She asked the right questions. She remembered the names of my colleagues, the status of my projects, the small ongoing storylines of my life. She laughed in the right places. She said the things a mother says. She had called me from that house, from that phone, every Sunday at 10:30, for 11 years. And now I was sitting in her kitchen trying to remember whether her voice had changed one August and I had simply not noticed. Trying to remember if there had been a Sunday call that felt, for just a moment, like talking to someone who was reading from notes. Couldn't remember. That was the thing. I could not point to a single call and say, that one, something was wrong, because I hadn't been listening for it. Because you don't listen for the wrongness in your mother's voice. You listen for the familiar, and the familiar was there, and that was enough, and that was everything. I thought about Christmas. I had come home every December. I had sat across the table from her, and she had passed the potatoes, and we had watched the same programs we always watched, and I had hugged her at the door when I left. I had driven away thinking about the highway and the weather and whether I'd remembered my charger. Not once had I stood in the doorway and thought, look at her. Really look. Is this her? You can miss something every day for years without knowing what you're missing. The absence has to have a shape before you can feel the shape of it. I called her. That sounds irrational, and it was. She had been dead for 2 weeks. But I picked up my phone and I scrolled to her name and I pressed call and I listened to the recording, her voice on the voicemail greeting, those 12 words she had recorded years ago, and I listened to them 3 times and then I went back to the photographs. I held the September photograph next to my phone. I looked at the face. I listened to the voice on the recording. Same and not same. Continuous and not continuous. The river and the water. The neighbor had been, by every account, a good neighbor. She had been kind to my mother. She had brought food over when my mother was unwell one winter. She had watched the house when my mother traveled. She had tended her garden reliably, fed her cat reliably, maintained her routines reliably. She had been, in every observable way, exactly what she appeared to be. I kept thinking about that. Whatever came back from that unannounced summer trip, wherever it had been, whatever it was, it had been kind. It had been consistent. It had maintained everything that needed maintaining. It had not disrupted anything. It had simply lived next door, quietly, doing no harm, for however many years were left to it. And my mother had lived beside it the whole time, had shared a fence, shared pleasantries, shared the small intimacies of neighboring, had kept the photographs, quietly, in the sideboard, addressed to her unopened, had never said a word to me. I don't know what she knew. I don't know what she saw in those photographs that made her put them away instead of burning them or bringing them to someone or calling me on a Sunday and saying, "Listen, something strange." Maybe she knew and she made a choice. Maybe she understood something I'm still working toward. That the thing next door was not dangerous. That it had simply replaced something quietly and continued on, and what was the use in naming it now? Or maybe she put the box in the sideboard because she didn't know what to do with it, and she died before she figured it out, and now it's mine. I took the September photograph with me when I left. The rest I put back in the box and left in the house for whoever comes next. I have looked at the photograph twice since then. I keep it face down in the desk drawer where I keep things I'm not ready to throw away and not ready to look at. What I think about when I let myself think about it is the phone calls. Every Sunday. 11 years. My mother's voice at 10:30, asking how I was, listening to the answer. I have no reason to believe those calls were anything other than what they were. I have no evidence of anything. I have a photograph with wrong eyes and a wide flat smile and the memory of a voice I thought I knew better than my own. She called me every Sunday. I always picked up. I never once thought to listen for the thing underneath the familiar, to check whether what I was hearing was the original or the echo of it. I don't know what that makes me. A good son, maybe, or just someone who loved the shape of something so much he never thought to look inside it. Both, probably. Both. The Alaska Highway does something to you after enough years. Not bad something, not good something, just something. It gets into the way you think about distance. You stop measuring in kilometers and start measuring in landmarks, in fuel stations, in the particular quality of darkness that exists nowhere else on Earth. There is city dark and there is rural dark and then there is northern highway dark, which is its own category entirely. A dark that has mass that presses against the windshield, that your headlights don't so much cut through as negotiate with. I had been driving that highway for 19 years when it happened. 19 years of overnights and early mornings, of coffee from thermoses, of the radio cutting out somewhere past the Yukon border and staying cut out for 300 kilometers. I knew every bend. I knew which sections turned greasy in the rain, which shoulders dropped without warning, which stretches of spruce forest went on so long you started to believe the world outside the cab had quietly ceased to exist. I knew mile 1083. I had driven past it hundreds of times. I had never once stopped there, and I had never once seen anything. That November night, there was a woman standing on the shoulder in the snow. On a highway like that, in weather like that, at that hour, a person standing on the shoulder is not a curiosity. It is an emergency. Every driver knows this. You do not think about it, you just stop. No coat, no bag, no visible vehicle in either direction. Just a woman, standing very still in the beam of my headlights, looking straight ahead rather than at me. Snow coming down in that fine, windless way it does when the temperature is deep enough that the flakes fall in straight lines. She was not shivering. That was the first thing I noticed, after the no coat. The temperature was -23. She was standing in it like it was a mild evening in May. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window. I asked if she was all right. She turned toward me then, and I want to be precise about this. She did not startle. She had not been waiting to be noticed, or hoping a truck would stop, or standing in the miserable tension of someone stranded and afraid. She simply turned at a normal speed, the way you turn when someone in the next room says your name and you are not surprised to hear it. She said she needed a ride to Watson Lake. She said it the way you'd say you needed directions to the post office. Matter of fact, unhurried, without the particular gratitude of someone who has been standing in -23 without a coat for any length of time. I unlocked the door. She climbed in. She was cold. I need to say that clearly, because nothing else about her suggested distress, and I don't want to imply she was imperceptibly wrong from the first moment. She was cold in the way you'd expect. Her hands were white at the knuckles, her face was drawn with it. I turned the heat up. She pressed her hands flat against the dash vent and said nothing. I pulled back onto the highway. I asked where she'd come from. She said she'd had some trouble with her car. Back a ways. I asked if we should call someone. She said it was fine. I asked if she wanted to use my phone. She said no, she was fine, Watson Lake was fine. She just needed to get to Watson Lake. So we drove. There is a particular silence that is ordinary and a particular silence that is load-bearing, that holds something up, that would collapse into chaos if it were broken. It took me 20 minutes to understand which kind I was sitting in. She did not make small talk. I tried twice, lightly, and the answers she gave were polite and complete and somehow used up the subject entirely, the way a door that fits perfectly in its frame leaves no gap for air. She was not rude. She was not cold in her manner, only in her temperature. She was just finished, present but finished, occupying the seat the way a fact occupies a sentence. I focused on the road. The snow was steady. The highway was empty in both directions. I had the wipers on low and the radio producing soft static and the heater doing its best. And after a while I heard her breathing slow and even out, and I glanced over and she was asleep. Head back, eyes closed, hands folded in her lap. Sleeping the way people sleep when they are very tired or very safe or past the point of caring about the difference. I drove. Watson Lake was another 40 minutes. I drove through the dark and the snow and the silence, and the heater ran, and the wipers swept, and I did not look over again because there was nothing to see and I was watching the road. Watson Lake appeared the way it always does. Gradually, a thinning of the dark, a scatter of orange sodium lights through the trees, and then the town itself, modest and specific and real. I slowed. I turned onto the main road. I said we were here. Nothing. I said it again, louder. I turned to look at her. The seat was empty. Not empty in the way of someone who has quietly opened a door and slipped out. The door was locked, the lock I control from my side, the lock I had not touched since she got in. Not empty in the way of someone who has moved to the back of the cab. The sleeper was dark and I could see the whole of it in one glance. Empty in the way of a room where something was and now is not, with no interval in between, no transaction, no moment of leaving. Her seatbelt was still fastened. I want to tell you I stayed calm. I want to tell you that 19 years on the highway had prepared me for the unexpected, that I had a framework for this. But there is no framework for a fastened seatbelt and an empty seat. There is no protocol. You just sit there in the orange light of a fuel station parking lot and wait for your hands to stop shaking. I pulled into the fuel station. I sat for a while. Then I got out because sitting was making it worse, and I went inside and I bought coffee I didn't want, and I stood at the counter long enough that the attendant asked if I was all right. I said I'd had a long drive. He nodded. He'd heard that before. I almost left. I had the coffee. I had the keys. I was already turning toward the door. And then I stopped and I went back to the counter and I told the attendant what had happened. Not all of it. I gave him the facts, flat and plain. A woman on the shoulder at mile 1083, no coat, no bag. I gave her to him the way you'd report a hazard. Specific, located, time-stamped. He stopped wiping the counter. He looked at me for a moment in the way people look when they are deciding how much to say. Then he picked up the phone behind the counter and made a call I could only hear one side of. He described what I'd told him. He listened. He said yes, the same location. He said yes, a woman, no coat. He listened again for a while. He hung up. He said an officer would come by shortly if I could wait. He said it in the tone of someone managing a situation they have managed before. I waited. The officer arrived in 20 minutes. Young, unhurried, carrying the particular composure of someone who has been briefed on something unusual enough that they have learned to lead with calm. He sat across from me at the small table near the window and he took out a notepad that I noticed he didn't write in, and he asked me to describe her. I described her. Height, build, hair, the way she held her hands against the dash vent. The way she had turned toward me without startling. The way she slept. He nodded slowly after each detail, not in surprise but in recognition. The way you nod when someone describes something you have read about rather than seen. He said they had a file on her. He said the file went back to 1989. He said this without elaboration, without drama, in the same voice you'd use to confirm a flight number. He closed the notepad he hadn't written in. He thanked me for stopping to report it. He said most drivers didn't. I asked him what that meant. Most drivers didn't. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said that most drivers who stopped at mile 1083 didn't come in afterward. They just kept driving. He said it the way you'd say a thing you've said many times and stopped expecting to explain. He left. I sat with my cold coffee. Outside the window, the snow was still coming down in straight lines. There are things that get filed and closed, and there are things that get filed and left open quietly on a shelf somewhere, because closing them would require an explanation that does not exist yet. The officer knew the difference. He had known it before I walked in. That was the part that stayed with me longest. Not what I saw on the highway, but the fact that someone had been keeping a record of it since before I had my license. I have driven the Alaska Highway many times since that night. Freight doesn't, and that was mile 1083. If this story left something sitting with you, good. That's where we live. Here on Unheard Fears, these are the stories that don't make the news, don't get explained, and don't leave cleanly. If you're new here, stay a while. If you've been here, you already know. Subscribe, and we'll see you in the dark.